Okay, guys, we're going to be watching somebody named Dr. Allen, and it's a 2-hour video. It's going to be a long video. I'm going to do a full ab workout video. I'm going to move the camera around. Don't mind me. Watch the video. This man has something very important to say about fasting and what fasting has to do for the body and the health benefits of fasting and how it can stop disease, tumors, cancer, anything really. And also it's helpful for a good workout. I even heard, I don't know his name, but he plays Superman and he fasts when he works out. And this man's swole, okay? And he works out vigorously. And what it does is increase the insulin level. So without further ado, y'all, we gonna get into this video. That's Dr. Allen right there on the left, probably your right. And this is the beginning of the video. Let's get it. And I'm gonna do a little bit more than just working out my abs. I'm probably gonna do a little bit of left arm focus. And yeah, let's get into the video, y'all.
Good. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming out here to do this.
It's my pleasure.
It's been a long time in the coming. We're going to talk about fasting. We're going to talk about a whole food plant-based diet, particularly your specific bent on it, the SOS version of a whole food plant-based diet. But before we do that, I think what would be really interesting and something about your work specifically that I find fascinating and that I appreciate is that it's very much rooted in as much in psychology as it is in nutrition science and physiology. And beneath all of that, again, which I appreciate, is the fact that there are some uncomfortable truths about our relationship to food that is premised in this vernacular around addiction. And as somebody who is long time in recovery, this is the lens that I kind of approach all of these things. And it's something that I think is under-addressed in this conversation about not just a healthy diet, but how we transition to a healthy diet. Because people, we're emotional beings. And it's less about the information than it is about trying to help people figure out how to traverse that tricky, sort of tightrope between old habits and new habits. And by kind of couching all of this in those uncomfortable truths about our addictive relationship with food, I think is really powerful.
Well, the reality is, humans evolved in a very different environment than the one we live in today. Mm-hmm. We lived in an environment of scarcity. So most humans actually didn't live to reproduce. They didn't pass on their genes. They died from predation. They died from starvation. A few survived, our ancestors.
Uh-huh.
Our ancestors were the winners.
Yeah.
They got enough to eat, they didn't get eaten, they lived long enough to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And our bodies and our minds were perfectly designed for that environment of scarcity. So now, human beings being the innovative creatures we are, we change everything. We change the environment we live in dramatically. And now we don't live in that environment of scarcity, at least most of us don't. We live in an environment of abundance. And although we're perfectly designed for that environment of scarcity, this environment of abundance can trip us up, and it does.
Mm-hmm.
And it's responsible for the systematic overeating that people do that leads to the obesity, that leads to the metabolic syndrome, that leads to the vulnerability to infectious disease and the chronic degenerative diseases, the cardiovascular disease, and many of the cancers. And so that reality is why it's so difficult for people to adjust to the idea that they just can't eat as much of whatever they want and get away with it.
Yeah. It's almost as if, if you're a heroin addict or an alcoholic, everywhere you go, everybody is a heroin addict or an alcoholic. There is no safe space, right? We've normalized our behavior and our respective relationships with food to such an extent that the radical notion is to step outside of that and do something different.
2/3 of people in industrialized societies are overweight or obese. If you're not fat, you're abnormal.
Right.
And if you go to a physician and say you're significantly overweight and you've lost a bunch of weight, the physician doesn't immediately think, oh, you must have adopted a whole plant food diet and begun an exercise program. Their differential diagnosis is, this could be colon cancer, eating disorder or drug addiction.
They pathologize a healthy choice.
Well, the only experience they have of people losing weight and keeping it off is when they've got cancer, they've developed an eating disorder, or they're a drug addict. And so it's not even in their expectation that people are going to actually get well. You go to a physician with most of the diseases of dietary excess, the high blood pressure, the diabetes, and they're going to tell you, look, you're going to be on drugs the rest of your life. If you do what I tell you, I promise you, you'll never get well. You'll be sick forever. Because it's not in their expectation that people are going to actually recover their health. Because they're not addressing the actual reasons why they're developing the problem to begin with. They're not addressing the causes of the problem.
I think in tandem with that, there's also this pessimism from the typical general practitioner that any advice or kind of advised protocols about healthy lifestyle change fall on deaf ears. It's like, yeah, I could tell this person they should go to the gym or they should eat better, and you know, maybe I'll say that, but there isn't a real expectation that that's going to move the needle, or that person is going to be able to adhere to any kind of prescribed lifestyle change. And
that's because we're dealing with people that are addicts.
Yes. And so talk about that. Expound upon that idea, because I think it's really important.
You don't just say to an alcoholic, oh, you know how your life sucks?
Yeah.
It's because you're a drunk. Stop drinking.
Yeah.
And the alcoholic would say,
I've been told that.
Oh, it's the alcohol? I had no idea. Thank you so much. I won't drink again.
Right.
It doesn't quite work that way. We don't currently lie to alcoholics the same way we do lie to people, for example, that are overweight. We tell alcoholics, look, you have a particular vulnerability. You can't drink. You need to come up with a strategy each and every day that allows you to not drink. And if you can figure out how to do that, you win. But if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. So the same thing is actually true in many degrees to people that are overweight. But what we tell the overweight person is, oh, just put your food on a smaller plate. Here, cut your food with a knife and put your fork down between each bite, and you won't be overweight anymore. You just need to learn to eat moderately and just eat a little bit less.
It's the analog in addiction is, you know, quit the whiskey and just drink beer, or put your beer in a smaller, or only binge on the weekends and maybe don't get behind the wheel of a car.
Right. And it's not real. We know with alcohol the answer is don't drink. And the truth is, for people that are suffering with obesity, for people that are suffering with these diseases of dietary excess, it would be better to avoid the chemicals that are fooling your brain into allowing you to systematically overconsume than it would be to pretend that you can just have a little bit. If you could have just had a little bit, you would have just had a little bit, and you would have had the thing under control. You can't, you don't. If you're an alcoholic, you're not the person that can have an occasional drink. Okay, and if you're the person that's suffering with these diseases, you may find it's easier to just adopt a strategy that eliminates these chemicals that fool the brain. We talk about this pleasure trap, the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain that results from chemicals that we put in our food that fool our brain. The chemicals we put in our food are things like salt, oil, and sugar. These are highly fractionated food byproducts, not food, and they stimulate the dopamine cascade in the brain. They make food taste better. They make food more interesting to us. And as a consequence, we will systematically overeat. Now, just like some people can occasionally have a drink and not become a drunk, some people can have bits of this without it becoming a health compromising problem. But if you're the overweight person, if you're the person with the heart disease, the cancer, the diabetes, it's not you. You're the person that would be better off saying, let me avoid those chemicals. I'll stop fooling my brain. I'll eliminate the systematic overeating. I'll reverse the disease and pathology, and I'll adapt a strategy that doesn't include continually beating myself up with these things that I'm not capable of regulating.
People have an easy time understanding that alcohol is a powerful drug, that heroin is something that is going to kill you. The addictive nature of these substances is well understood. But when it comes to food, that's a leap of faith for a lot of people. It's a bridge too far to say, I understand alcoholism and drug addiction, but when you start talking about food as addictive, you're starting to lose me.
Yeah, well, the reality is that the neural cascade that's associated with addiction of any kind is very similar. Now, I'm not arguing that alcohol or cocaine or heroin might be even more potent than, say, the sugar or the oil or the salt or the combination. But the net effect of salt, oil, and sugar in the diet is actually obvious and devastating around us. It's why you see obesity and the disease of dietary excess. That's what's making people fat. It is the hidden force that undermines health and happiness. It is a pleasure trap. And because people don't recognize it, it's very difficult for them to take action to eliminate it. At least with alcohol, most people know, oh, if you're an alcoholic, you probably shouldn't drink. If you go to a party and they say, oh, you're gonna have some alcohol, and you say, well, I can't because I have an alcohol problem. Most people at least will be tolerant of you because, okay, you got an issue, you don't have to drink. But if you go in and you say, oh, no, I don't want to eat, you're going to really upset people. Oh, what's wrong with this? My doctor says this great. A little bit won't hurt. What's wrong?
Yeah, so it's complicated. It's complicated in terms of the internal psychology in trying to reframe our relationship with food, but there's also all of these social constructs that create even additional complexity that make it very difficult to modify behavior.
There's no question. In fact, the social roadblocks to health are probably some of the limiting factors. Yeah. I think that's probably true in all addiction, though. You know, one of the challenges for people with alcohol is oftentimes the social consequences of not participating. And this is definitely true with food. We've built so much of our social interaction around food that even if you're looking to just modify the type of food you eat, it can be very upsetting for people, and they can get really defensive about it.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about the pleasure trap specifically, what that is. You co-authored this book, seminal work with Doug Lisle. I've seen his TED Talk. I've seen him give his presentation many times on this subject. And that really, elucidates this dysfunctional relationship with food and why it is from an evolutionary and psychological perspective.
Well, there's this idea of dopamine is a neurochemical associated with pleasure. And there's two behaviors critical for human beings' survival, and that is food and sex. You have to get enough to eat in order to be able to sustain yourself, and you have to engage in enough sexual behavior so that you can pass on your genes and the whole process can start over again. So it's not surprising that food and sex are heavily reinforced. And the way the brain reinforces the body's behavior is by rewarding us with dopamine, which is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. So the more dopamine, the more pleasure. The more dopamine, the better the food tastes. And so you react to food in response to largely caloric density. The higher the caloric density, the more valuable it is in this environment of scarcity in which we evolved. And so the higher caloric density foods tend to be more reinforced, more dopamine, better tasting. So what we've done as humans, we're innovative creatures. We said, if a little good, a lot's better. Let's figure out a way to make the food taste even more special by increasing its caloric density. And we do that by adding things like oil and sugar to the food. And as a consequence, we like it better. And if that's what you get used to eating, that's all you like. And eventually people get to the point they really don't like the taste of simple, whole, natural foods anymore because this hyper drug-like stimulating effect of the more concentrated foods is more appealing. So we literally become addicted. For example, if you want to neuroadapt to a lower salt or lower fat diet, it actually takes time in order for the body to go through that adaptation. We can speed it up with fasting, but the bottom line is there's a period of adaptation where food doesn't taste good. If you eat whole foods and you're used to eating highly processed foods, it's not that appealing. Now, over time, you adapt, and then the body gets to the point where you like the simpler foods again.
Yeah, people have a hard time believing that you adapt. There's this baked-in assumption that you're staring down the pipeline of a lifetime of drab foods that are unappealing, and you're just going to have to tolerate it.
We know there's a literature on this, though, with, for example, sodium. People use a high-sodium diet. It takes about a month on a low-sodium diet for the average person to neuroadapt to a lower-salt diet. With fat, it takes almost 3 months.
Wow.
It takes 3 months on a lower-fat diet before that satiety mechanism that's used to being kicked in by the higher caloric density fat begins to adapt, and you will feel satisfied on a lower density food. So the fruits, the vegetables, or grains, legumes, you will now feel satisfied, whereas initially you don't because you're used to being satiated with these this high fat intake, and that can take months. And so it's a problem if you say to a person, well, look, you're going to eat this new diet, you're going to feel like crap, and you're not going to like it. But it'll only be a few months.
Right.
Adherence may be lagging. Whereas if you can make that process happen more quickly, the ability to get people to make dietary changes speeds up, and that's what we found with fasting. And sometimes that's a way of getting people to the point where good food tastes good more quickly.
Yeah. there does seem to be something about preparing people for that stage of acclimation. And there also seems to be something magical about the 90-day window in with drugs and alcohol. That's sort of the typical window that people say it takes about that much time to kind of wean yourself off these cravings and reset your system. A lot of people just they're not willing to weather that period of discomfort. And perhaps there's a lack of belief that they'll reset and be able to reframe so that, what they once craved, like to get over the craving, you have to deprive yourself and then you reboot. And then those things that have held you hostage for so long suddenly hold less and less power over time.
And the fact that it can happen more quickly with fasting is really an interesting thing. For example, smokers. It's not easy to quit smoking once you're addicted to nicotine. But most smokers, by somewhere between day 2 and day 4 of fasting, no longer report withdrawal effects from cigarettes. Now, some people say, they're so miserable fasting, they don't even think about them, cigarettes. But the reality is that whole adaptive process just is sped up dramatically. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have psychological and social challenges afterwards that you still have to address in order to sustain good behavior patterns. But just getting rid of that first phase of a physical withdrawal and just feeling so crappy and feeling like, you're wondering why you're putting the effort out, getting that behind you quickly really does enhance a person's ability to make the transition to being drug-free.
I understand when you were talking about caloric density, fat and sugar, these are things that are evolutionarily, we're wired to seek out and to maximize. The salt thing, though, that's different. Like, why is it that salt is such a trigger for people?
Yeah, this one is probably the most controversial recommendation that we make. People have come around, as you said, with oil. They realize a highly fractionated food product like oil, high caloric density, little satiety feedback. They can understand that. Sugar, pretty well accepted that refined carbohydrates, they cause your blood insulin levels to rise, and then it drives your sugars lower, and it fools the brain, and now you got cravings, and that's what a lot of the binging and craving and stuff comes around, is because of physiological alterations of refined carbohydrates. But salt also is a really important part of this, and let's talk about a few reasons why that might be. Number one, salt is an essential nutrient. That is sodium. It is an essential nutrient, without which you die. Fortunately, you get all of the sodium you need in a whole natural food diet, just like you get all the sugar you need and all the oil you need. You don't have to add a fractionated concentrated food to get the amount of sodium, the milligrams of sodium that's needed to sustain optimum health. Salt also has a powerful effect on passive overeating. And you can do an experiment yourself. If you just sit down and figure out how much brown rice you'd eat until you feel satisfied, until you don't want any more. And on a different day, everything else being equal, salt it up and see you'll eat significantly more before you feel satisfied. Now, some people say, it tastes better. Well, what do you think tasting better means? It means it's stimulating more dopamine in the brain as a result of this artificial type response. And you will systematically eat more on heavily salted foods when you're adapted to that than you will whole natural foods. The other thing is salt has a preservative effect, doesn't it? When they salt foods, it's to keep bugs from being able to affect it. Well, you have 5 pounds of bacteria living in your intestinal tract right now. 1 trillion creatures, 1,000 strains. Very important to your immune system to protect you from infectious disease and other problems. And these 1,000 creatures are living, eating, and pooing inside you right now. So if you have 5 pounds of organisms pooing inside you, you might be concerned about what they're pooing in you, because they might be pooing some nasty toxic waste, chemicals like TMA, which becomes TMAO and irritates the vessels and creates a problem if you're eating animal foods. If that's what you're feeding your bacteria, you're feeding your bacteria soluble fibers, you're getting fertilizer, you're getting vitamin K, you're getting a lot of other good stuff. So if you want your bacteria pooing fertilizer into you want to make sure you're feeding them healthy diet. If salt is a powerful preservative, let's just imagine what happens when we put a high sodium diet into this bacterial-rich environment. It can alter the gut microbiome. And so sugar can affect it, oil can affect it, and so can salt. So it's been our experience that salt in the diet is an important part of obesity for many people, that it's an important part for causing fluid retention, which increases blood volume, which is associated with not just high blood pressure, but also the joint pain, the congestion, a lot of the aches and pains that people have oftentimes is because of this fluid that the body retains to protect itself from the consequences of salt. Mm-hmm. So it has many downstream effects, even though it doesn't have any calories per se. It can still be an important part of the dietary excess profile. And by eliminating the sodium from the diet, you also eliminate a lot of the highly fractionated foods that you just can't eat without salt. Yeah. Even products like bread and cookies and crackers and a lot of this stuff without the salt really doesn't taste that good because they've refined out most of the natural flavors of the food. And what they do is they take these federally subsidized grains like wheat and soy and corn, and they add oil, salt, and sugar to it, process it into various looking foods, and call that the diet. Go into a grocery store and walk around, and you'll see a lot of those foods are really nothing more than one grain or the other with various concentrations of sugar, oil, and salt.
Right, which basically allows you to make anything taste good. And you strip away those things, and there's something completely unpalatable,
right?
and nutritionally deficient underneath it.
And so what we're encouraging people to do is a really radical departure from what they're currently doing, but that's to adopt a whole plant food diet that's free of this added chemicals, free of the salt, oil, and sugar. And what you're left with is things like fruits and vegetables, raw or cooked, minimally processed grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. But you don't have the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, sugar, and highly processed fractionated foods that make up the majority of the people's diet in industrialized society. And it's that diet that makes them fat and sick and develop the diseases of dietary excess, and that what makes you vulnerable to infectious disease. You know, when you look at what are the vulnerabilities about why do some people get an influenza or a COVID or an infectious disease, and, you know, they recover, they survive, they have minimal consequence. Other people, it's devastating or deadly. Well, if you look at the risk factors associated with what makes people vulnerable to these diseases, as well as the diseases, the chronic diseases, the heart disease, the cancer, the stroke, it's the same metabolic syndrome and all of its associations. Yeah. It's the same obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure and all the consequences of dietary excess. These are reversible and preventable conditions. People don't have to have these conditions. And even if they have them, they can largely reverse them by taking responsibility to control what they put in their mouth.
So this is the underlying premise that drives True North, which you founded, like 30 years ago at this point, 35?
In 1984.
Wow.
Was when my wife, Dr. Morano, and I started True North Health.
I can't imagine what it must have been like to basically open the doors to this medically supervised water fasting clinic back in that time. I mean, now it's all the rage. We have Walter Longo and all kinds of scientists studying the phenomenon of fasting deeply. It's part of the public awareness. It's very cool to be out there, sort of experimenting with intermittent fasting. This was not the case back then. I mean, potentially criminal, right?
Well, at one point, the California Board of Medical Quality Assurance had rendered an opinion that recommending fasting to a patient constituted such a gross violation of the standard of medical practice that it rose to the level of criminal negligence. I was actually the first person in my family that required the services of a criminal defense attorney. My father was so proud.
Wow. What happened there?
They ultimately decided that recommending fasting was not criminal negligence, that in fact, there was even a provision at that time in Medicare to pay for fasting, but as long as it was for rapid weight loss necessary for urgent surgery. If you got well, unfortunately, it wasn't a covered benefit. There was also, every hospital today in this country will use versions of fasting for treating conditions like acute pancreatitis. And we were able to demonstrate that this was not criminally negligent behavior, but was actually a rather innovative look at trying to help sick people get well. We've gone from being criminal quacks to cutting-edge researchers. As you said, there's been some wonderful people like Walter Longo and Mattson and Fontana and others that have published in major impact journals this idea that fasting or some modification of intermittent fasting or modified fasting could be a helpful tool. In fact, it was interesting. Longo did some research that I think really was pivotal. He looked at cancer treatment. And he took, 30 rats with cancer and gave them enough chemotherapy to resolve all the cancer cells. You have to kind of kill all the cancer cells or they grow back. The problem is all the rats died. So that wasn't a really good outcome. But he took the same rats with the same cancer and the same chemo.
Okay, so when he says the same same rats, he means the same type of rats. He doesn't mean the rats who died.
Chemotherapy. But he used fasting before, during, and after the treatment. And not only did all 30 rats survive, but dramatically enhanced cancer-free survival. And so what he found was that there was these things like differential stress sensitization and differential stress resistance, that cancer cells were more vulnerable to the effects of chemotherapy in the fasting states, probably because of their higher metabolic rate. They don't adapt to the environment without glucose as well. There's lots of differences in cancer cells to healthy cells. And in the fasting states, the cancer cells were put at a selective disadvantage. And not only that, healthy cells appeared to be protected during the fasting state from the effects of chemotherapy. And at that point, people went, particularly pharmaceutically oriented people went, oh, so fasting could make the drugs work better. Oh, well, maybe it's not quackery after all. And so there was a lot better tolerance and acceptance of this idea that perhaps fasting may have a role in enhancing conventional treatment. Now, it was interesting to note, too, that many of the biomarkers that predict cancer and disease turn off whether you use chemotherapy or not. Wow. So the act of fasting itself puts the body in a selective environment that may be more conducive to healing. And so this type of research, of course, now is taking off, and there's been a lot more interest, and including by the work that we're doing at the True North Health Center.
Yeah, you have this this study and this experience working with a patient who had stage 3 follicular lymphoma, right? Where you had like this tremendous result.
Yeah, we had a young woman with stage 3 follicular lymphoma that had been well documented, excisional biopsy, the whole bit, and had progressed over a period of a couple years. And she had asked her family physician along the way, was there anything she could do conservatively in terms of diet and lifestyle? And he had assured her that diet had nothing to do with follicular lymphoma, that she could eat whatever she wanted to eat. And when she inquired about fasting, he informed her that fasting was criminal quackery. Nonetheless, she decided that she didn't want to undergo conventional chemotherapy because with this particular condition, it's not really effective. It doesn't affect all-cause mortality. There's a lot of side effects, and so often it's not unusual for them to defer treatment until the condition is quite progressed. In this case, it had progressed enough that he referred her to the medical school, talked to an oncologist. Oncologist also reinforced the idea that diet was irrelevant to this condition, that fasting was unproven. And even with that advice, she decided to come to True North Health Center, underwent 21 days of water-only fasting, during which time her tumors that were previously externally palpable disappeared. Wow. So we fasted her for 3 weeks, fed her for 10 days, sent her back to the oncologist, and he examined her, couldn't find any evidence of the lesions, expressed some surprise. She explained, he said, what did you do? And she said, well, I went to the criminal quacks and I did the fasting and the tumors went away. And he said, well, that's very impressive. Suggested he'd give me a call and talk to me about it. She asked to have the follow-up CT scan that we requested. And we had warned her that they might be a little reluctant since she didn't have any obvious evidence of symptoms. And he said, well, she didn't really need a CT scan. But she said, well, she'd really like to objectify the changes that had occurred. And he got a little nervous, but ultimately he did agree to order the studies. And he mentioned that because she was still a little bit neutropenic, maybe some gentle chemotherapy might still be a consideration. Nonetheless, she refused. After a couple months, her white counts had normalized. By a year, she's doing great. Sent her back, got a whole, follow-up evaluations. And at that point, we decided that it was time to try to write up the report. So we wrote up this case report. We submitted it to a British Medical Journal, and after some back and forth, they eventually did publish the paper. They had asked us if we could get the oncologist to sign on, and so we wrote him a letter and thanked him so much for all the confidence he had shown in referring the patient to us for fasting. And
which he didn't. Okay.
Well, in spirit. And but unfortunately, he hasn't gotten around to responding to us yet, so we didn't.
So how long ago was this?
Well, what happens? We published that paper, and then they asked us to do a follow-up. Because they said, about 10% of lymphoma patients will go through periods of remissive state, but sustaining it would be impressive. So we followed this patient for 3 years. And she continued. She had lost substantial weight. She had maintained that weight loss for 3 years. I think in part because I explained to her that, she had to stick to the diet or it could be fatal, because I'd track her down and kill her. And I think she believed me because she stuck to the diet. And at 3 years, we got a whole body CT follow-up with the oncologist, and she's completely cancer-free. At that point, we submitted back to the British Medical Journal, which had invited us to do the follow-up. They actually refused the article the first time. We appealed and resubmitted, and then they did decide to publish the follow-up. One of the reviewers felt like, well, maybe she just got lucky. But anyway, so she resolved her problem. She maintained it for 3 years. We now have a 4-year, and now we're working on a 5-year follow-up. She continues to do well. Now, since then, and since the publication of that article, we've managed to treat a number of patients with various stages, including stage 4 lymphoma. And so far, the results look very promising. We have some follow-up data now. We're in the process of submitting another case report with long-term follow-up on a stage 4 follicular lymphoma. And ultimately, we're hoping to publish enough case reports that we can do a clinical trial.
That's amazing.
We can justify a clinical trial because I think we're going to do very well with this condition in highly motivated, self-selected patients that are willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise and go to bed on time. The results seem to be promising.
What led you back in the 80s to basically open this clinic that's premised upon fasting? Like what was it about your education or your experience that you found this protocol, and what led you to believe in it, in its efficacy?
Well, yeah, it was deep frustration. Being constantly beaten by Dr. Lyle in basketball. I grew up with Dr. Lyle since 4th grade, and we played basketball, and he would beat me. And
you've known him your whole life?
Oh, my
I didn't
life,
know that. Wow.
Whole life. And, it was really frustrating because he's really good. And he's just naturally got tremendous talent. So I just thought, well, I've got to be able to beat him somehow. And so I started reading some books. I came across a book by Herbert Shelton, and it made sense. The idea that, health was a result of healthful living, and that diet played a role. So I thought, well, I'll get an edge. And I adopted this diet vigorously and lifestyle vigorously, thinking this was going to allow me to beat him. Of course, it failed miserably because he adopted the same kind of eating pattern. He still beats me to this day. Here we are, 61 years old, playing basketball. I still can't manage to beat him.
Your whole life is basically a result of you trying to beat
Dr. Lyle.
Okay.
And it's frustrating. I picked the wrong guy. I didn't even realize that, the person I'm trying to beat
this bookish Stanford psychologist, how hard could it be?
I thought, finally I was getting desperate. I thought, well, he's too quick. He's got good. I can't, but maybe I can beat him in a free throw shooting contest. Because I thought, free throws is just practice, right? So for 6 months, I go out, I'm shooting 500 free throws a day, really working on my form. And I just casually one day say, hey, Doug, why don't we do a free throw shooting contest? And he says, okay. He hasn't even played for a week.
Well, he strikes me as a world-class sandbagger, like the guy who's always going to tell you that he's no good, right? He's always downplaying, right? That's his whole strategy for all of this.
I go out and hit 48 out of 50, and I'm thinking, I got it. He hits 19, misses one, and then hits 80 in a row.
80 free throws in a row.
99 out of. Of course, I'm telling him, well, what a joke. If you can hit 99, why don't you just hit 100? I mean, So the point is, total failure, got involved trying to be a better basketball player. But what I would say is that we're both still playing. And so, how good you can become in a sport may largely be dependent on genetics and luck. How long you're going to live in life may be largely dependent on genetics and luck. But how well you're going to live in the time you have left may be dependent on what you put in your mouth and the diet and lifestyle choices that you make. And so what we're trying to explain to patients is you're not going to live forever. You're going to die. There's been over 100 billion humans, modern humans born on the planet. There's 7.3 or 4 billion alive today, but there's only been 5 well-documented people that will live past 117. So the thing is, you're not going to live forever, but you don't have to spend the average 9.6 years of debility or 17 years in poor health that the average American is spending, giving up, compromising the last decades of life that could be your richest decades of life because of chronic degenerative diseases, because we haven't taken control of our diet, sleep, and exercise patterns. And that's what we're trying to point is you may not be able to live forever, but you can reduce dramatically the years of debility that you have, your vulnerability to infectious disease, your likelihood of developing heart attack, stroke, and other debilitating conditions. That's where the big payoff is. Not living forever, but living well until you die, having a good life and then having a good death.
All right, so how does the fasting come in, though, as a pathway towards that?
So fasting is interesting because you're dealing with people that are oftentimes addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in their brain, whether it's to drugs or dietary issues. Fasting is a great way of breaking that cycle. It can be a very effective way of getting the person to the point where good foods taste good. It's a great way of lowering the blood pressure enough you can eliminate the medications, along with the chronic cough, fatigue, the impotence, and premature death that's associated with them. Normalizing the blood sugar levels, so your insulin levels normalize, so you don't have the cravings and the binging and all the other stuff that sometimes go along with it. Or in autoimmune diseases, oftentimes pain is significant, inflammation and swelling. People can't be active. They can't dissipate their tension. They aren't able to engage effectively. And so when you get people out of pain, it's like an epiphany experience. And now the motivation goes up. It's hard to be motivated to make diet and lifestyle changes when you feel like crap all the time. But when you get a taste of feeling good again, it's very motivating. And now oftentimes that's enough motivation to help people overcome their addictions and their tendencies. The reality is I found the most effective patients are those who are most motivated. And motivations that are the most powerful is pain, debility, and fear of death.
Yeah, 100%.
The only problem is, a lot of these people, they get out of pain and they're not fearing death anymore. And then they might slide a little bit because they think I'm better now. I don't have to work quite so hard. So, there's challenges on both sides. But
yeah.
The reality
but you guys have had a tremendous success with keeping people on the path. Like the recidivism rate for you is pretty low compared to other.
In fairness, though, we have highly motivated, self-selected people.
People are
willing
to you
to
in
fast.
really bad shape.
Well, they're motivated.
It's one thing to talk about intermittent fasting or a fasting mimicking protocol. It's another thing altogether to talk about a 40-day water fast.
Well,
that is a very extreme
Moses,
thing.
David, Elijah, Jesus, and our patients, do fasting.
It is interesting that fasting shows up in all these various religious traditions.
Isn't it interesting? The Jews, the Jains, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Christians, all of these religions that diametrically opposed on so many things, that are killing each other in the street over disagreements, they have one thing in common, and that's a tradition about fasting. Because fasting changes how you feel about yourself and the world around you. It can't help it. And so True North Health Center is not coming from a spiritual orientation. We're coming from a very much of a health orientation. We have different doctors with different backgrounds, and we don't try to impose our beliefs on anybody because we're not the experts in, how you get into heaven or any of that stuff. Our focus is health from healthful living. But virtually every major religion has a tradition. I mentioned not just about fasting, but also about the value of a whole plant food diet. These traditions resonate throughout history. And, the reality is perhaps it's because that's what works.
How dare you? All right, so walk me through. All right, well, first let me say this. So in the decades that you've been doing this, you and Doug have taken, and your staff, I've had Chef AJ in here explain to me her, experience of being she goes to True North like for vacation when she wants to get out of town. She's got to be your most regular customer. But I've had Dr. Longo talking about fasting. Who else have I had in here? I've had True North comes up all the time on the podcast. So I've heard about it anecdotally. And over the years, you've taken like 20,000 people through this fasting procedure. And had tremendous success. So I want to understand the process that is entailed here. Somebody comes to you, they're in bad shape, they're overweight, they have hypertension, diabetes, obese, cardiovascular disease, whatever. This is the kind of person that's arriving in your doorstep.
So the first step is that they usually go to our website. So they go to truenorthhealth.com and they fill out the registration forms, which gets us their medical history. And we get their previous laboratory work. That comes in and they get a free phone conversation with me. So we offer people free.
You still do that, right?
I still do that.
People can call up and you'll give them a free consult.
I still do that. So I talk to them as a screening about whether or not fasting might be appropriate, if anything that we do or we recommend might be helpful. For many people, they may not even need or be ready for fasting, but they may just need to talk to a doctor that's not a complete idiot. And so we have a phone coaching service where our attendings are available. They go online through the website. We have all their medical records put together. They can schedule a formal phone consultation with one of our attending physicians. They can discuss, get a second opinion. They can do whatever they want to do, where they talk to a doctor that can look at their history objectively and give them advice. If they're appropriate candidates for fasting, then I schedule them into the center for a stay. I give them an idea about what we expect is a reasonable period of time. They come to the center. They go through with one of our attending physicians a history exam, laboratory monitoring. We initiate them into a fasting protocol if that's appropriate. And then after fasting, they go through a refeeding process. Now, while they're there fasting, they're seen twice a day by our staff doctors. We make sure it's done safely and effectively. They're monitored carefully. We have detailed educational classes, what I call brainwashing, where they're able to go through all in detail the process about what they're going to need to do, why they're going to need to do it. There's some social dynamics because they're there with other people from around the world that are getting a chance to do this. Our facility has about 70 patients staying at it. So they're interacting with those other people plus the staff and the educators. And so it's a pretty immersion type of an experience. They go through fasting, they go through refeeding. If they have specific health problems, we have chiropractors, naturopaths, body workers, all that kind of stuff, that they can get the kind of attention that they need. And then when they're going home, they have very specific recommendations that we expect them to follow, and we try to provide follow-up support. And then because of the phone coaching, they're able to continue to access these attending doctors affordably without necessarily because half our people are out of state, 15% are foreign, they're not all living locally where they can pop in and see our doctors or use our deli business or any of that kind of stuff.
What are the important vectors or variables that determine the appropriateness or for somebody to do one of these protocols? Not everybody is suitable for this.
No, the biggest one is that they have a condition that is appropriate for fasting. So there's many people that are not good candidates for fasting, and we can talk about that. There are some things that are particularly amenable to fasting. And for example, the conditions that are caused by dietary excess are particularly responsive to fasting. It makes sense. Obesity, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, certain forms of cancer. These conditions we know are made much worse by poor dietary choices. So it's not shocking to find out that fasting, kind of the ultimate in undoing the consequence of excess, would facilitate the recovery of those patients. And it does, and we've been able to prove that. We've been publishing papers looking at these conditions like high blood pressure, looking at diabetes, looking at autoimmune diseases. And the fact is we can, in highly motivated patients, generate safe and effective responses with fasting.
Right.
In fact, we've actually published a fasting safety study, the first comprehensive look at long-term water-only fasting and what the risks are and aren't in response to this process. So we've been able to show it is a safe process when it's done according to protocol. In fact, Dr. Longo, who cautions people in his book about long-term water fasting and its safety, makes an exception, and that's if people fast at the True North Health Center, because he's familiar with our safety data. Now, I evaluate other scientists' intelligence based on how much they agree with me.
Right.
So I consider him a genius.
I'm glad to know your bias is intact here. If somebody has anorexia nervosa, or if somebody is on the other side of chemotherapy where they're maintaining their weight is an issue, I would suspect that that's probably not a great candidate. What about somebody who's coming in and they're on a battery of medications? You would have to wean them off of that, I would presume, on some level before they could undergo this.
Yeah, there's most medications, you do not water fast while you're taking medications. Those have to be weaned down beforehand. But we have physicians that are experts at helping people unwind the consequences of their medical treatment. And most medications, interestingly enough, the day you change the diet, you have to begin changing the medication profile.
Right.
Because the
medications are treating the diet.
Most people are being treated, that is medicated, for their diet. When you change their diet, the need for medication dramatically responds. You have to reduce the blood pressure medication. You start crashing these patients because they're not going to be hypertensive once you eliminate the reasons why they're hypertensive. And they're not going to be needing the same level of medication once you normalize their dietary intake as far as their diabetes or getting them off their pain medication. Once they don't have the pain, they don't need to be on all that oxy because now the pain is being reduced because the inflammation is being reduced because of the dietary change and then ultimately the fasting. So that's one of the reasons why fasting does need to be done in a controlled, medically supervised setting. It's not the kind of thing that you do long-term fasting at home.
At home, right.
So you do that in a controlled setting where there's been a proper history, exam, lab, and daily monitoring. So we're seeing each of these patients twice a day, and that's how we're able to ensure that this is a safe and effective experience. So they may withdraw their medication with careful feeding, initiate the fasting, normalize the condition, and then after we're done, most of the time there's no need for medication. Because their blood pressure, they've gone from 220 over 120 capped out on 5 meds to being 120 over 70 off medication. And so there's no reason for anybody to want to put them back on drugs that cause chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and premature death if the condition's actually normalized. Now, the side problem is you have to keep on the healthy diet and lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because you're not curing anything. You're just managing it.
But you've rebooted this operating system and wiped the slate clean so you can build a new foundation.
It's
for
very
those
much
habits.
like treating when your computer becomes corrupted and you don't know exactly what's wrong, but you turn the thing off, you turn it on, you can't explain, but now it's working.
Right.
And it seems
when
to
in
be
doubt,
that way.
reboot.
And we're trying to figure out exactly what those changes are that's occurring in fasting. I know the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in what's happening because they want to come up with what are called fasting mimicking drugs. They want drugs that'll do just what fasting does to you, but without that nasty fasting, and something that they can sell in a pill.
Yeah.
So a lot of the research that's of interest is trying to figure out what exactly is it that's happening in fasting that's allowing the body to get well so that we can try to reproduce that without having to go through the process.
Right. I mean, that's my next series of questions. Like, does it have to be water only? What is it about that deprivation protocol that is so special, physiologically, that is causing this cascade of positive impacts? Like, what would happen if you were eating a little bit? I mean, I know Longo has his fasting mimicking protocol where he is allowing people to eat something like, 600 calories a day, and he's able to reap some of the benefits of what you're experiencing without having to go on a complete water fast. But what is happening to the body when you're depriving it of food in such a, comprehensive way? Yeah,
the intermittent fasting protocols are just that, fasting mimicking diets or fasting mimicking programs, trying to reproduce some of the changes that we know occur with fasting without the risk profile or the complications of long-term water-only fasting. And I think they can be very effective, as they've demonstrated. However, long-term water-only fasting has a much more profound impact on these mechanisms that are associated with fasting. For example, just the most obvious is weight loss. When you're water fasting, you're going to lose an average of 1 pound a day. Now, some people say, well, you lose weight, but then you gain it back afterwards. Now, interesting, we've done a study. We have now recently acquired a Hologic DEXA scanner with the new software that allows you to do a whole body detailed composition that looks not just at percent body fat, but how much visceral fat there is. And we have a paper that'll be coming out that looks at the fact that, yes, you lose a bunch of weight fasting and you regain some weight after fasting, but it turns out the weight you regain after fasting when you're eating a whole plant food diet is exclusively water, fiber, glycogen, and protein. There is no fat. In fact, the fat profile continues to drop during refeeding, even though the scale weight obviously goes up as you rehydrate, put some fiber back into the gut.
As long as you adopt.
As long as you continue to adopt the whole plant food, healthy, dietary style. But the point, the old wives' tale was, well, you lose fat and you just gain the fat right back. Well, that might be true if you go back to eating greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh processed foods, but that's not what's happening in these patients that we're refeeding appropriately. And so weight goes up, but the weight that goes up is re-alimenting your glycogen stores and muscle stores, which is really exciting. So preferentially, not just do you lose fat, but you preferentially lose visceral fat. That the ratio of visceral fat to adipose tissue loss is 3.0. In other words, there's a significant preferential mobilization of this very type of fat that we think is most compromising to health. The fat, the abdominal fat, the fat that stores around the organs. So now we have what may turn out to be an effective strategy of specifically mobilizing visceral fat. Now, we've done some preliminary work. We're actually enrolling patients in a study starting in August, looking specifically at body composition changes long-term with follow-up. So, we'll be able to speak more definitively about it by the end of the year. There's also a process that happens in water fasting that you don't see as profoundly influenced in juice diets or modified diets, and that's natriuresis. There's a selective mobilization and elimination of excess sodium from the body in water fasting that happens right away. It's very powerful, more powerful than, say, taking hydrochlorothiazide or a diuretic, and it's responsible for the big dump in fluids that happens initially on fasting that drops blood pressure so dramatically, gets rid of the congestive heart failure symptoms, that eliminates some of the arthritic symptoms and joint swelling and the non-healing wounds. And this body selectively getting rid of this excess sodium that's accumulated that the body's having to deal with because of the dietary choices. The traditional justification for fasting was the idea of detoxification. This idea that there's toxins in the body And now we know that's true. They've actually been able to
That's controversial.
Well, it's actually not controversial in the sense that you can take a fat biopsy of a human and break it down, and you'll find there's hundreds of different chemicals there at various concentrations, PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues, mercury. And the only thing that's controversial is say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Well, it turns out it does matter. It just matters at different thresholds to different people. And so this idea of rapidly mobilizing toxins during fasting has been so well accepted by some that they say that's the reason not to fast, is the body would rapidly mobilize these fat-soluble nutrients too quickly, and your body wouldn't know what it's doing, and it would overload your system. Unless you take their proprietary products, then apparently it's okay. But what our experience has been that there is a rapid detoxification. We know that there's some studies looking at, they've even done total body load measurements before and after fasting and showed that PCB levels would drop. Clinically,
well, you're not taking any chemicals into your body, and you're allowing the liver and the kidneys to just do what they do, right?
But it's more than just what you would calculate through burning 2,000 calories of internal fluids. There's a selective and rapid mobilization. For example, with tumors, let's say you have a breast tumor and you lose 10% of your body weight. You would assume that you'd probably lose 10% of your tumor weight. But what happens for example, in lymphoma, you lose 100% of the tumor. So the body's preferentially mobilizing some nutrient stores versus others, and it seems to be able to do that in inverse proportion to the value of those tissues to the body.
Right.
So it's getting the visceral fat, which we think isn't probably healthful fat, before it's mobilizing adipose fat, and certainly before it's getting to critical nerve tissues and other things that are preserved. The body has an intelligence where it's unwinding itself. And what we're suggesting is it appears that both endogenous and exogenous toxins are preferentially mobilized in water-only fasting at a much more powerful rate than they are, say, when you're going on a healthy diet and lifestyle. And that may be a justification for trying to facilitate and speed this process. There's also the effect on enzymatic induction. Think about athletes. One of the things of being a trained athlete is you induce, for example, glycogenolytic enzyme systems. You get better at mobilizing glycogen stores. And, this whole business of carb loading and trying to increase glycogen storage so you have more to pull on so that you don't hit the wall so quickly when you're running that marathon or whatever. You get through that process. Though that is induced with persistent exercise. The same enzymatic production for glycogen, for lipolytic enzymes, for protein, for gluconeogenesis enzyme systems is induced during fasting. Because you have to mobilize all your glycogen stores. You're emptying the chamber. You're taking that battery and draining it all the way down. And it suggested that not only do you induce improved efficiency of enzyme systems, but they persist after fasting, which is just like you get better and better at exercising every time you do it. You get better and better at fasting every time you do it, which is perhaps one of the justifications for intermittent fasting. If you fast 16 hours every day, and you limit your feeding window to an 8-hour window, you may be inducing some changes in that, even that limited fast, that 16-hour fast, day after day after week after month, cumulatively, that may have a very profound effect on body physiology. And that's one of the suggestions that's being made by those advocating intermittent fasting or short periods of fasting, that cumulatively it may be. Well, when you do a long-term fast, this is a huge impact. And now this is some of the stuff we're working with people like Luigi Fontana from Washington University, where they're looking at changes in microbiome, changes in whole body composition, changes in these various exotic biomarkers, and what happens in short-term and long-term fasting. Nobody knows yet, because we're really the only people doing and monitoring long-term water-only fasting and its physiological effects. Right. So this is all virgin data and very exciting. But what we can see clinically is that when you induce changes with exercise or you induce changes with fasting, they're often the same changes. If you look, for example, exercise, people that exercise, 2 rats in a cage, genetically identical. Give one rat an exercise wheel and the other not. Everything else is equal. The rats with the exercise wheel, 1, they'll use it, and number 2, they don't get Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And they said, well, why? How does exercise prevent dementia? And they look at those rats and they find out that BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is dramatically higher in rats that get their exercise, lower in those that don't. The ones that don't, much more vulnerable to Alzheimer's. Well, BDNF, it turns out the precursor to that is beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which is the fatty acid that your brain is preferentially mobilizing during water-only fasting. BDNF goes up with water fasting just like it does in exercise. Glycogen mobilizing enzymes go up in exercise, just like they do in fasting. In fact, all of the biomarkers that we've been able to look at that are improved with exercise improve with fasting, which is weird because you think, well, wait a second.
Wild.
Exercise, you're out vigorously running around, inducing all these changes. Fasting, you're sitting around, we don't even let you exercise much. You maybe could do a little yoga. How is it that they would do the same thing to the body? But when you think about it, exercise and fasting are both reversing the consequences of dietary excess. When you exercise vigorously, when you fast, you're undoing the consequence of dietary excess. I'm not surprised at all that fasting induces the same kind of biochanges that we see with exercise. In fact, for us, it's saving a lot of time because we just look at all that vast exercise literature and start looking for the things they've discovered and seeing how much of it's mimicked with fasting. I think that both of these processes, fasting and exercise, share a common biological benefit. And that's why we're seeing the biomarkers changing with both.
That is crazy.
The other thing that happens is insulin. Insulin is the hormone that drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells where it's needed to burn. So if you look at type 2 diabetics, you might assume mistakenly that they don't have enough insulin. They have plenty of insulin. They have more insulin. It doesn't work because there's insulin resistance. There's resistance to the insulin carrying out its function. So what drug can you take that reverses insulin resistance? There isn't any. There's drugs that'll force sugar on the cell and they have all kinds of side effects. What can you do to reduce insulin resistance? Well, you could exercise. That helps. Weight loss, healthy diet. You can fast. Fasting has a profound effect on insulin resistance. In fact, as much as 80% of our type 2 diabetics can achieve normal blood sugar levels without medication. And if they're willing to continue to do the diet and the exercise, they can often sustain those results. Now, you might say, well, couldn't they do that with just diet and exercise? Absolutely. Many diabetics that are able to make aggressive diet and lifestyle changes over enough time are successful at resolving and reversing their diabetes, but it's difficult. For people that aren't able to do it on their own, that's where we would use the next level of support and intervention, which is fasting. It can also be a little tricky unwinding the medications and all that kind of stuff. So, doing whatever it is, whether it's feeding or fasting in conjunction with doctors that are able to be supportive and that have an expectation of you getting well is important. Now think about it. If you go to a doctor and you've lost weight, does the doctor assume you've adopted a healthy diet? No. They assume you've got an eating disorder, you're a drug addict, or you're dying of cancer. That's the differential.
Yeah.
Colon cancer, eating disorder, drug addiction. Because many doctors have never had an experience of a diabetic getting well. I gave a lecture this year in Texas at a medical conference for physicians who specialize in diabetes. So there's 250 people there. What are they serving them? Pulled pork sandwiches, chocolate cake. Most of them are overweight or obese. I do my presentation. I explain our results. Afterwards, one of the docs comes up. He's about maybe 70, 80 pounds overweight. He says, I've been in practice 25 years treating diabetics. I've never seen one get well. Mm-hmm. He's never had the experience of a single patient recovering, stabilizing their blood sugar, getting off medication. It's not part of the paradigm. Well, how likely is he going to give meaningful diet and lifestyle advice to a patient when he doesn't do it himself, doesn't even know that it would work, or even if he thought it would work, knows the patient's not going to do it because people don't make diet and lifestyle changes. He's seen the literature, 93% recidivism rate, to ask people to make diet and lifestyle changes, very difficult.
So when you get up and you give a presentation like that to that type of audience, what is the receptivity to what you're saying?
Well, in the past, it was aggressively negative. Now it's actually becoming where at least a percentage of the audience is actually interested. The way that we made that contact was one of the doctors that runs the residency training program came in, had his own experience, wanted it for his students, and now those second and third year residents can rotate as part of their training at the True North Health Center so they can get the experience of actually doing something that some of them have never done before, which is see these patients get well. Because under a conventional treatment, you don't get to do that. And it turns out there's some doctors that rings their bell. They like the idea of a patient's getting well. And so they're willing to put the extra time and energy and effort in. Right. But if you're in a traditional system, if you're in an HMO system and you're a physician and you have to see 26 patient contacts a day, do you think you have time to review their history, do an exam, write the prescriptions, and then sit and chit-chat about them, why they've got to give up everything that they eat?
No, the system isn't set up for that.
No.
It's not set up for that. It's not set up for the accountability that's required to get somebody to maintain any kind of lifestyle change protocol anyway.
And I'm not sure many of them even realize that it's actually worth their time because they've never actually seen it happen before. So, you know, and of course, the criticism is, well, yeah, but you're working with special patients. Well, that's true. We're working with the people that are highly motivated, self-selected, willing to make diet and lifestyle changes. It is I'm not saying you can take our advice, give it to everybody, and everybody's just going to go, oh, great, a whole plant food diet, just what I wanted. That's not the reality. But for people that are willing and interested, they should at least have the right. Somebody should at least say, well, you could go on this diet and lifestyle, you know, but it's a lot of work. Or you can just take these pills and you'll be sick forever. What do you want to do? You know, but they don't even know that. It's not. I can guarantee this physician I was talking to never tells his patients, well, if you did radical and diet lifestyle changes, you could get. Well, I'll give you an example. My brother's 6 years older, so we're raised together. He's slowly gaining weight. His wife adopts our diet, comes in and fasts, overcomes her own health issues, is on a vegan program. 15 years later, my brother's still eating chicken and doing stuff and getting fatter, and he can't play volleyball anymore. His legs all swollen up. I'm poking him, but he won't do anything. Finally, he calls me from the hospital. He says, Alan, I'm in the hospital. I had a heart attack. I said, that's great. He goes, no. You don't hear, I had a heart attack. I said, I heard you. Best thing that could have happened. So he said, oh, they want to do a quadruple bypass. And I said, well, talk to your surgeon. He asked the surgeon, he says, if you do a bypass, won't they plug up again? And the surgeon said, yeah, eventually, but it lasts longer than stents. And he says, what if I made radical diet and lifestyle change? He said the surgeon laughed at him. He said, Mark, you're not going to make diet and lifestyle changes. Come on. Checked himself out, got on a whole plant food SOS-free diet, lost the 50 pounds, back to playing volleyball, passed his stress test, still has his vessels. Wow. But my own brother, it took
it's willingness.
Pain, debility, and fear of death.
It's just like in 12-step. It's like it's all about willingness. And pain is the fulcrum for that, right? When people are in a desperate state or they've suffered a severe medical trauma like that, then they're ready to actually implement those kinds of changes. Short of that, it's very difficult. And I think that speaks to the pessimism that most practitioners have about the viability of advising somebody to change their lifestyle habits.
Absolutely. I completely understand. This is amongst the most difficult thing you can ask a patient to do. Adopt a health-promoting diet in a world designed to make you fat, sick, and miserable. Not an easy task, certainly not for sissies. And in my brother's case, he had the advantage. His wife, my sister-in-law, already doing the work of providing support to the family with healthy food and stuff, but still difficult. Now, I just saw him a few days ago. Looks great. Completely different person. Do you think he's going to it wasn't worth it? I mean, no, it's the best thing he's ever done. Fabulous.
So you approach fasting from a perspective of weight management and also disease prevention and reversal, but there's also all this emerging science around longevity and anti-aging. Of course, that's Longo's specific lens on this, but by dint of autophagy and all these other biomechanical systems that are affected by fasting, there's now this whole world of research opening up around prolonging life as a result of this.
I actually think the people that are going to turn out to get the most benefit from fasting, this 1 and 2 week fast that we do with healthy people, is healthy people. Healthy people that are looking to stay healthy. For example, to avoid vulnerability to infectious disease, to avoid the problems that, not waiting like my brother did till he has a heart attack, but the people that are willing to use it to prevent the problems from the beginning. And interestingly enough, I've been communicating with Walter Longo recently about doing a joint study where we're going to use his expertise and access and our facility to do some look not just at intermittent fasting, but long-term fasting, and compare and contrast and see what the very best bang for the buck, so to speak, of is in terms of taking healthy people and helping them stay that way. We've got a study that's planned for next year looking specifically at exotic biomarker changes with these dietary changes, with fasting, and then trying to differentiate how much fasting, how frequently, what's the right combination. That's all relatively new territory. There's other impacts of fasting that are not as well recognized. For example, the gut. You have a tunnel through your body that starts at your mouth and it goes down your esophagus and then your stomach and your intestinal tract and it gets to the rectum. You got a hole at one end and another hole at the other end. And digestion is essentially shoving things in one hole, trying to push it out the other hole. But it's only the stuff that gets absorbed through the intestinal mucosa that enters the body. And that intestinal mucosa acts like a screen keeping flies out. If the screen becomes inflamed, things can leak through. That's essentially what gut leakage is. And the things that cause inflammation of the gut, we believe, are free radicals that come from not just smoking or drinking alcohol. You know, smoking, it's obvious. You see smokers' face, cross-linked collagen tissues. We know that's cross-linkaging from the free radicals from smoking. It also affects the enamel lining of the blood vessels. It's my contention that cigarette smoking may protect people from getting lung cancer. Protects people from. Well, think about it. 80% of smokers.
How can you say that? Come on.
80% of smokers never get lung cancer, and 20% of smokers get cancer. And I believe it's because smoking kills people from heart attacks before they live long enough to grow their tumors. Because of the damage to the enamel lining of vessels, cardiovascular disease may occur slightly quicker than the inevitable lung cancer would have. And so if you could make smoking more dangerous and kill everybody from heart disease, perhaps they could advertise it as cancer safe.
Okay, now I understand.
Well, but, you know, they say statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. And the fact is, you can look at this data and twist it around in a way that sounds good, even though it's completely ridiculous.
Right.
Smoking damages enamel lining. It causes lung cancer. Alcohol, peroxidation of alcohol, leads to cirrhosis of the liver. Why do you think people that drink a lot of alcohol get fatty liver? It's a scar tissue that comes from the detoxifying effect of that nasty alcohol. But today, they're trying to tell you that alcohol is health food. If you don't drink, you should start. That resveratrol, the little bit of powerful antioxidant from this grape skin, is some justification for drinking alcohol. They're trying to tell you, it thins the blood like aspirin does. So if you're on a greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet and risk of clotting stroke, that thinning effect is going to reduce your risk of dying from a clotting stroke, which might be true, but you're going to increase your risk from a hemorrhagic stroke. You're not going to reduce your all-cause mortality. So the only reason to drink alcohol is if you'd rather die of a bleeding stroke than a clotting stroke. Maybe that's a justification.
You're a passionate man, Dr. Goldhamer. Why is it that, why 40 days or 21 days? Like, what is it about that extended period that's so important?
Well, what we do is we want to fast as short as possible, but long enough to get the problem resolved. And so it's not like we're setting out to try to beat Jesus in fasting duration. We don't go over 40 days generally, because if you keep the fast under 40 days, there's few metabolic complications. As you start getting into the really long fasts, the 60 days, the 80 days, the longer fasts that were done in the past, it's a much more delicate balance in terms of electrolyte balance and other things. And so the guy that I trained with, Alec Burton in Australia, used to do fasts as long as 100 days or longer. And I asked him, by the time I got there, that was 36 years ago, he was no longer doing over 40 days as a routine, just very occasionally. And I said, why? And he said, well, because of the sleep deprivation. I said, oh, I didn't know that patients had any more trouble sleeping on long-term fast. He goes, oh, no, not the patients, me. He had sleep deprivation. He was just worried too much. He'd worried too much about it. So he decided to keep it to 40 days because we knew from experience that that was the period of time you could go without getting into more of the complications. So
there's no electrolyte supplementation or vitamin and mineral supplementation during this period? You're looking at me like I'm crazy.
Water-only fasting is the complete abstinence of all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest.
A particular kind of water?
We use fractionally steamed distilled water just because it's pure water. Patients that are fasting get really sensitive. They won't tolerate municipal contamination and other stuff. They just want pure water. It's H2O. It's just what rainwater would be if the environment wasn't polluted. And so anytime you start supplementing, like, for example, there were some long-term fasts done by medical authorities that killed people. And the reason why is because they supplemented. What they would do is they would supplement potassium if potassium got low. But if you don't allow something to be the rate-limiting nutrient, and you're not measuring, obviously, everything that's possible to be measured, you can get into depletion of something else. And they did. And you see evidence in the literature of myocardial fibril breakdown or other problems that you'll not see if you don't let the rate-limiting nutrients be rate-limiting. For example, potassium is pretty sensitive. If you don't supplement potassium and you use potassium as a rate-limiting mineral, all the downstream things that you might not necessarily know to measure are not likely to become an issue. So we use 3.0 potassium as an arbitrary termination. If it gets below that, then we modify the protocol. Now, it's not necessary to do that. You could push people further, but if you use that as a protocol, we've proven you can do it safely and effectively over 20,000 consecutive times. The reason why we've been able to do this so consistently is we have strict protocols that we follow that are time tested and proven. And supplementation of electrolytes, although you might think, well, potassium's low, we'll just give them some potassium. But that's an example of letting arrogance exceed your ignorance, because you don't know what the downterm consequences of that is. And so we're using a protocol that we've been able to test. Now, it may be there's a better way to do it, and that's why we do research, and that's why we look at these things. There may be, but until that's done, I exercise caution, because the fact is you're in a physiologically vulnerable state, particularly in a person that's coming off medications and has a health history, and you want to make sure that everybody that walks in walks out, and that's why we use the protocol we do.
I would suspect also a psychologically delicate state. Walk me through the experience of this journey that you see with the typical patient. I mean, you're demanding a lot of them. They're going through something they've never done before. Like, what is the... what is that like for that individual when they're on day 3, day 10, day 30?
Yeah, so the first few days of fasting are actually the most difficult because you're adapting off a glucose metabolism into a fat metabolism. So the brain is changing fuels from burning sugar to burning largely beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which comes from the ketone bodies from the fat breakdown. So there's an adjustment there. You're detoxing oftentimes a lot, although we've learned to minimize the effect of detoxification by getting people to eat a fruit, vegetable-only diet for a few days before we start fasting. That's made a huge difference. So they're not coming off caffeine addiction at the same moment that they're trying to adapt to the fast. They've already gotten that stuff out of their system. And that's actually the most difficult stuff, getting the cigarettes, the caffeine, the alcohol, all the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, processed foods, all the host of chemicals that people are putting into their body with over-the-counter prescription medications. So we've gone through a wean-down process, and then we start fasting. And their mouth may coat up and taste like something crawled in there and died, and they may have some skin rashes or elimination. They may get mucus discharge. They may get some vivid dreams. They may have aches and pains, and they may have difficulties with all kinds of adaptive processes, but they go away. And then something else comes along, and then it goes away. And then it becomes very empowering because they realize that they're able to get through this process, that just because they had a headache doesn't mean they have to rush out and try to suppress those symptoms with a pill. It goes away. The body's able to heal itself. And then once you get into 4 or 5 days of fasting, the body's pretty well acclimated to the fasting. At this point, there's no hunger. People are going to cooking demonstrations. They're coming to lectures. They're going to the dining room to socialize with people. They're 5 days, 10 days into a fast. You think, oh my God, you haven't eaten for 10 days? No, I just enjoy being there.
That's crazy.
Not a problem. So then, depending on the patient, sometimes they start getting relief. Their pain, maybe for the first time in years, the pain that they've been suffering with is going away. And they may find that, some people who have these chronic debilitating problems start resolving. Things start falling off. Tumors start shrinking. They start getting excited, like, oh, maybe there's something to this idea of the body healing itself. And, we're monitoring these patients to go through the process. And then at some point, you get to the point where there's a limiting factor. Maybe their electrolytes start to drop a little bit, or their energy is not acceptable. They're not able to maintain adequate ambulation. Or maybe they've just got, that's how much time they've got. Because, some people have jobs and lives and responsibilities. So we only have so much time to
here
work
for
with.
40 days.
Yeah.
So my life completely craters on the outside.
But for many people, this is an intense epiphanic experience because they've got this intense education that they're really open to. They've seen these other people, sometimes what looks to them like miracles going on, because they're seeing people that they have no expectation that could getting well. They're experiencing themselves sometimes for the first time, a sense of empowerment because they're able to actually reverse these processes that they were told nothing could be done. Learn to live with it. What do they expect at their age? That's just how it is. And now they're thinking, wow, if they were wrong about that, maybe they're wrong about other things too. And they start, looking at all aspects of their life.
The empowerment aspect of it has got to be huge. Like, even if you set aside all of these, physical benefits that are a result of this, simply the fact that they did something that seems impossible, very, very difficult, and get to the other side of it has to, make them feel like, okay, now nothing is impossible. Like, I just did this thing that almost nobody does. Now, what's the next challenge that I can tackle?
The idea is that many people think that if you fast, you die. They believe if they got on a plane in New York and they were to fly all the way to California, they would die over Colorado, except they ate the peanuts.
Yeah.
You know, that the pretzels saved their life.
What do you eat when you fly?
And somehow, if you fasted for 10 days or 20 days, sometimes the idea that you might have to skip a meal because there was nothing healthy to eat doesn't seem quite so overwhelming. There's definitely empowerment. And I think that the other thing that happens is when you start feeling what it feels like to be you instead of what you'd become, that's very empowering. I think the same thing happens to athletes. You know, when people first start exercising at first, it's not pleasant. They got aches, they got pains, they're fatigued, they're not getting the success, they can't do what they want. But as they do it, they get to the point where not only do they tolerate, they're not just doing it because they want to, you know, maintain the weight or get the figure or whatever it is. They're doing it because they start realizing they're getting real intrinsic benefit from engaging in this consistent activity. And now they don't want to give it up. And I think the same thing happens when people really get into a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah,
they
they're
realize
invested.
they don't want to go give it up and feel like everybody else feels because of some greasy, slimy, convenient food. They're willing to pay the price of trying to do the planning and do what it takes to try to ensure that they can get their needs met. Just like I think people that get into a regular exercise regime realize that now this is so beneficial, they will literally structure their schedules around making sure that that's an important part of their activity. And the same thing happens with sleep. When you realize how important sleep is to health and maintenance and energy, you start prioritizing that. And you don't compromise your sleep, you don't compromise your exercise, and hopefully you learn to not compromise your diet and lifestyle. I tell people, here's what you need to do. First, get enough sleep, because it's your most critical activity. Then engage in regular exercise so you can dissipate the tension, you can build fitness, and have the time to prepare and eat healthy food. If there happens to be any time left, well, fine, you go to work.
Let's talk about the food part of all of this. So, well, first of all, does anybody freak out in the middle of this and flee? Like, I can't handle it? Like, there has to be some people that just psychologically can't handle it.
You'd be surprised. By the time people come to the True North Health Center, they're pretty well vetted. They've gone through some screening. We've evaluated their history. They're usually pretty motivated. Most of the time, the only way they find out about us is some doctor or somebody they know has referred them to us to begin with.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like you're not going to refer somebody that, if you know what's going on there, that's not going to be a good candidate. So there's a lot of filtration that goes on. And so the exceptions that I've seen, I've had some patients that are coming off drugs like cocaine and other stuff that don't last 12 hours, you know, because they're not really ready to make the change. But as far as fleeing because of diet, no, because the True North Health Center is set up to meet people where they're at. Not everybody's ready to do vigorous water-only fasting, or would it even be appropriate? So for those individuals, maybe we just do a healthy eating regime. And just eating the diet, doing the classes, doing the yoga, the meditation is enough to induce significant changes. Sometimes after they've been a while, they might say, well, you know, maybe I'll try a little intermittent fasting, or maybe I'll try a little bit of a fast and see how I do with that. And that's fine. So it's not like everybody comes in and we lock them up and that's it. In fact, you know, I tell a story. When we first moved to the new facility, one day a really large police officer showed up at the door and he said he wanted to interview one of my patients. And I asked him, what did they do? And they said, well, you know, I don't need to know. And I said, well, if you want me to tell you if they're here or not, I need to know, you know, what the issue is. And he said, okay, we got a complaint. And the complaint was from this patient's relatives. And they said that the patient was being held against their will by religious cultists and being starved to death to go to be with Jesus. And I thought, I'm saying, look, the person's not here involuntarily. And he said, well, I got an interview. I said, fine, I'll let you interview him. But first, would you like a nice tall cup of Kool-Aid?
Right.
And Dr. Lyle says that when a police officer puts his hand
relishing
to his hip,
your role as a cult leader.
he is not comfortable. And I'm not to speak to authorities anymore, but
That's
you know, I'm thinking it's an obvious joke because Kool-Aid's full of sugar. We wouldn't serve that at the True North Health Center.
Well, I know, it's funny.
The reality is that today it's not as much of an issue because now the idea of fasting doesn't seem
it's very
quite
much
so
extreme.
It's
in the culture now.
It's not the Jim Jones kind of, you know, perception.
Right.
So it's not
Are you
as entertaining
still the
now.
only medically supervised clinic that's doing this?
Well, you know, I'm really excited because I just visited yesterday. One of our doctors that trained with us, Nathan Gershfeld, is running a facility here in the Los Angeles area. And it's beautiful. I went to see his facility, and it's absolutely beautiful. And for anybody that, you know, and also we have another doctor, Dr. Ewan in Ohio, that's opened up a small facility, is doing really well. I've gotten excellent feedback from people. We have other doctors that we train. We have an intern residency training program. And those schools, I mentioned Texas A&M, there's other medical schools, the naturopathic professions graduates can come and spend a year as a resident doing a rotation at the True North Health Center. The chiropractors often come and spend 3 months as part of their training at the True North Health Center. And those doctors, we're hoping to open up more facilities around the country. And we make people that contact our website can get access to whoever the local fasting supervisors are. And we're happy to provide that information. And it's really exciting to see these guys not only learning how to do it, but actually figuring out how to get these places open and offer affordable care to people. And the thing that it's always gratifying to see the clinical results that they're seeing, because it's really a hard thing to do in an outpatient practice.
Yeah.
Unless you can control a person's environment, it's hard to really induce these kinds of profound changes.
It's got to be incredibly gratifying as a medical practitioner to see such dramatic results.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons we've been successful. We have a dozen clinicians now at the True North Health Center. We have 5 medical doctors. We've got osteopathy, chiropractic, naturopathy, all represented. And these doctors, once they come, they often are with us their entire career. In fact, Dr. Clapper recently just retired after 9 years at True North Health Center. We joke that we're like the firm, once they start. But it's because they like the low patient intensity. In other words, they're not having to see high volumes of patients, so they're spending a lot of time with a few people instead of a little time with a lot. They like the center setup where the doctor's able actually to get all that intense education done without it coming out of the visit time, that they can spend the visit time really working with the patient's specific needs, and they like the idea that people get well. And so the combination of that allows us to keep the doctors, even though they probably work harder for less with us than they would if they went off and worked for the local HMO or whatever it is, that it's enough gratification, enough benefit that those doctors really like working at True North Health. And we're able to keep them.
What is the kind of current relationship that you have with the conventional, medical establishment? Like, how are they perceiving what you're doing now?
Well, it's been a revolution, actually. It's been amazing change, because when Dr. Sultana, who's been with us now about 20 years, came, the first thing we did is we got him to take a job with the local hospital as an urgent care doctor. And so he became known to the medical staff there and the nurses, and he's such a wonderful doctor. They loved him. And so that allowed us to have a good relationship with the immediate. We have a trauma center, just a mile away. And so some of their nurses or patients of ours, we provide chiropractic support to the nurses at that hospital. Some of the hospitalists purchase their food through our outpatient deli. So we have a good working relationship. And now that they're seeing some of our referral patients that we're doing for diagnostic workups and people getting well, that's really helped too, because they're not used to seeing people actually recover. And so today it's completely different than it was 20 years ago, where we were seen as some kind of, crazy people. Now, I think they see it as a little bit odd and different, but at least for people that have whatever it is they see get well, acceptable. And they know we're well-intentioned. The other thing that's made a big difference is we've published a number of papers in peer-reviewed medical literature, including on the safety of fasting, the effect of fasting on high blood pressure. We've recently finished a study with the Mayo Clinic looking at primary prevention of stroke. That's in review right now at a major journal. We're hoping that we'll get positive publication of that here in the next couple of weeks. We've done a study with Luigi Fontana from Washington University looking at biomarker changes in the gut microbiome before and after fasting. We have a couple other studies that we're enrolling in right now. So now we're getting some affiliations with some of these major players like Walter Longo, which is going to allow us to get into journals that we might not otherwise have been able to access because of the power that these guys bring.
His credibility and his pedigree, I would imagine, is very helpful.
Oh, he's done unbelievable, just fabulous work. And he's a wonderful guy. We're so fortunate that, we've got these kind of people out there trailblazing into the scientific and medical literature. Because as clinicians, and particularly alternative health clinicians, we're not always viewed with the most open mindedness from much of the medical profession.
Well, the other big piece here is the diet and nutrition piece. I would suspect that a lot of people come to True North because they saw you and they saw those case studies portrayed in What the Health, the documentary. We all saw those individuals, their kind of before and after stories that were very dramatic. And a big part
heavily
of that.
criticized.
And heavily, controversial for sure.
We have people telling us, I see there's stuff on the internet that says those people were all paid actors. It was
really?
all, reverse Photoshop. And I've seen some unbelievable.
I think Kip and Keegan just kind of grabbed them randomly, right? Like, how did that happen?
They showed up and wanted to do the film, so we did some interview. And then they came back and they said, well, they've decided they wanted a little more. Can we just interview some of your patients? And they went out to the courtyard.
Just whoever happened to be standing around.
I wish we could have cherry-picked it and stuff. But
there was that one guy, he had all his pills, he went through all of his medications and all that kind of stuff.
The point is that type of experience is pretty routine.
Yeah.
At True North Health. We see what looks like miracles. It's not miracles at all. It's just getting rid of the crappy diet, instituting a whole plant food SOS-free diet, and using fasting effectively. That's the reality. And I know they've got a new movie coming out, and I know they've done a bit of filming with us as well. Also, I'm very excited that I think it's September, Netflix decided to do a special on wellness.
Oh, they did?
And one of their 6 shows was filmed at the True North Health Center.
Oh, wow.
And it's on fasting.
Who's behind that? Do you know?
I don't recall who the producer and what else, but I know it's purchased by Netflix. It's a Netflix original.
Oh, that's cool.
So I know it's going to get pushed out.
I had John Lewis in here a couple weeks ago, who's working with Keegan on the Hungry for Justice project. And so I've been behind the scenes kind of looking at what they're doing. That's going to be a really big one.
I imagine it'll be very controversial and probably piss a lot of people off. I'm really excited to see it.
Keegan, that's Keegan's specialty. Yeah. But all right, so the food part, the protocol that you recommend and that you apply with your patients is, owes its debt of legacy to Caldwell Esselstyn and, a whole legion of those pioneering doctors who have put the whole food plant-based diet onto the forefront of public awareness. We've seen it grow in adoption and recognition, and we're seeing the benefits of that. I think it's still, somewhat controversial. There's all these diet wars with the low carb people and now ketosis and all of that. So that's kind of going on in the background here. But maybe you can just speak to why you believe so strongly in a whole food plant-based diet.
Well, the exclusively whole plant food diet, I think, has a lot of support, whether it's John McDougall or Esselstyn, or you mentioned one of my heroes, T. Colin Campbell, just a brilliant guy. So they all make a very compelling case that people should eat a whole plant food diet. And
since you call it a whole plant food diet, I notice that you always do that instead of calling it a whole food plant-based diet. What's the reason for that?
So I went whole plant food diet because a plant-based diet implies that it's based on plants, but it allows it allows flexibility.
Interesting.
And so I think that Dr. McDougall and Dr. Campbell would argue that we want to have as broad a diet as possible to attract as many people as possible. Because remember, most people in the vegan vegetarian movement are not just interested only in health, but actually dominantly in animal rights, moral, ethical, and spiritual reasons, environmental impact. And so their argument is, well, maybe it doesn't have to be Mr. Perfect, diet. If it encompasses a broader range of people, we'll get more people doing it. We'll save the planet. We'll save the animals. We'll go to heaven, whatever it is. And I don't disagree with any of that. That's great. But when it comes to maximizing health, if a person's overweight, wants to lose weight, if a person has heart disease, diabetes, if they've got cancer, or if they're healthy and their goal is to live the maximum healthy life possible, I believe the evidence supports the idea of an exclusively whole plant food diet that's free of SOS. SOS is the international symbol of danger, and it stands for salt, oil, and sugar. Now, can you have a little salt and still be healthy? Yes. Just like sometimes people can have a beer and not be a drunk. But for my patient population, which is either sick people that want to get well or the healthy people that really want to maximize their health, a whole plant food SOS-free diet, I believe, will prove to be the most health-promoting diet out there. Now, is it the best diet for society to add? No, I'm not arguing that. I'm so grateful that people like Dr. Campbell and Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. McDougall are out there educating the world. I'm not that nice of a person. I'm only interested in my patient and the maximizing the people that's in front of me. And the people that I see are often sick or healthy and want to stay that way. And so I believe that is the best advice for them. Now, does that mean somebody can't have a more flexible diet and still be healthy? Of course they can. And if it's working for you, that's great. I'm not going to argue with it. But if you're struggling, don't pretend that there's not another level of compliance that's possible. And I suggest people try it this way because they might find out, they don't miss all that salty, sugary stuff anyway. And they may be just as happy. And if not, that's fine. If you can modify the diet, maintain the numbers, not screw up our outcome data, I'm not a policeman. I'm just trying to give you the best advice I can. But I do believe I'm right. Now, if it turns out I'm wrong and the evidence supports that you're better off having more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day because that's an important reason for some reason, then I'll change my recommendation. Okay, I'm recommending what I'm recommending based on the combination of 36 years of clinical experience watching people get well and my ability to interpret the scientific literature and the staff that we have at the True North Health Foundation that are doing the same. And so, up till now, a lot of the stuff that we used to advocate was criticized heavily. Mm-hmm. Most of the stuff that we've been advocating, if you go back for 36 years, has been accepted as reasonable. The two things that we do that are still controversial is recommend a lower sodium intake than some of our colleagues. And this type of diet ends up having about 1 gram of sodium in it, naturally, and water-only fasting. Mm-hmm. And I believe in both cases, the data is going to prove we're right. Mm.
What do you say to the low-carb proponent who tells you, listen, we need some of these oils in our diet. Healthy olive oil has its place. We've seen that in the Mediterranean diet. We've had tremendous results with people losing weight and maintaining their weight and reversing a whole litany of conditions. So, why not just go that route? Like, when you have to measure those two protocols against each other, how do you think?
Well, there's
about
a number
that?
of protocols you're actually covering there.
Yeah.
But, like, for example,
but these things get conflated in this conversation that's going on.
The dead Dr. Atkins diet, the high protein, high fat diets, they'll argue, well, we got weight loss. I don't disagree. And a lot of times what's really good for short-term benefit isn't necessarily the same thing that's good for long-term outcome. Same thing in athletics. You can inject anabolic steroids and you can get some pretty powerful short-term effects, but then you get the testicular atrophy and you get cancer and die, and it's not so good in the long run. So what's good for short-term weight loss isn't necessarily the same thing as what's good for long-term health support. And I don't disagree that a lot of these programs are effective for weight loss. Heck, you can cut the hip off at the leg and lose 40 pounds overnight. Now, it may not be, a net benefit to you, but just because you want instant weight loss, there's lots of things you can do. As far as the other alternatives, which is maybe a higher fat, low protein diet inducing a ketogenic state, that may very well have some short-term benefits. It may even have some long-term benefits. But when you compare the results that we see clinically in the conditions that we treat, there's nothing I've seen that's worked better than an exclusively whole plant food SOS-free diet. And I have the luxury of having patients living with me sometimes for a period of a year or more. So we're able to really test the diet and see what it takes for them to actually recover their health. That's one of the downsides of living with your patients, because if they don't get well, who can you blame?
Right. They've been with you for
We've
a year.
got
Wow, you have
control of
people
their
stay with you for a whole year.
Sometimes longer than a year. I've got people there now longer. Well, sometimes we've had people checked in that were being sent to the nursing home. We came as the alternative, and then they get well and go home. And it was, $2,000 a month less staying with us than at the nursing home. So, for those individuals, it was an economic benefit. Other people come in because they're going to do long-term fasting, long-term recovery. They've got serious health problems. Sometimes it takes a couple months just to get people off all their drugs. Some people come in because they don't feel comfortable living freely, because they've got some issues with food and eating. They want to live in a controlled setting until they really get it down so they feel comfortable going out there. And the same thing true with alcoholics. Some people, you say, quit drinking, and they quit. Some people go to outpatient treatment. They do great. Some people do 30-day programs. Some people do 90-day programs. Some people, have to do longer.
Yeah.
So you have to make it to meet the patient's need. So I'll tell you a funny thing. We have this phone coaching thing I told you about. And so one of our doctors, Dr. Chilaveras, does a lot of phone coaching with people. And so people would call up on me and we decide, okay, they need to come in and fast, but it's a couple months before we have an opening. So I say, why don't you work with Dr. Veras in the meantime? And when you come in, you won't have to be here so long. And then they go and get well. And it's happening a lot. I'm giving her a hard time. I say, you got him well before we could come in. We screwed up our study, our documentation. They're all well, but it's okay.
How many beds do you have, though? You probably are at capacity most of the time.
Yeah, we can handle about.
Well, I have mic mute. Okay, guys, that's basically the video. Fasting is good for you. This man explained the benefits of fasting and how it's good for you. Usually, when I work out, I don't eat before I work out. I find it slows me down, and it makes me not want to work out. I get more energy by not eating before I work out. Don't go run and not drink water. I don't recommend that. I recommend you guys drink water, period. This man has some very good ideas, and especially when it says when you just don't want to go straight up fast. I recommend people do a Daniel fast first, to where they do nothing but fruits, nuts, and vegetables, and then they go to the water fast, to where they can either do it for 40 days. I recommend you slowly progress into it. So you probably do 2 days of water fasting, and then you will keep on adding on, but you'll go back into food, preferably not so much of meat, because you're trying to lose the weight, and what that does is in your gut, like he was saying, the bacteria, that is actually true. So yeah, that was the video, guys. Like the video for this information can be pushed out forward. Not a lot of people know this. We have a lot of overweight people in our community, so this would be very good for them, knowing that a lot of them don't want to get up and go walking in the morning, or don't want to go to the gym. This is very simple to do, and it's just your diet. And this is what I've been preaching on this channel, even though I'm working out while I'm preaching it. Well, while I have somebody else preach it for me, because I don't want to be the only one on here telling you what to do, because it just gets annoying at that point. Like, man, this man's always telling me to change my diet and do this and do that, man, blah, blah, blah. And then I get this white man on here to say it to you, and then you be like, he has a good point. And you be like, yeah, he has a good point. Jesus did it. Daniel did it. Actually, you read in the book of Daniel, he did it to prove a point that he was stronger than the man who were eating a whole bunch of meat. After a certain amount of days, he can lift more, he can run more, he was stronger, he had more stamina. And like I said in the last video, he didn't say it, but I'll say it. If you got ED, this will stop it. So erectile dysfunction. And also for women, it cleans out your gut. And a lot of that deals with, what's it called? Starts with E. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I don't gotta say it. It fixes a lot of problems down there. Let's say that. It makes you smell good. Water. Let's say that. Anyway, guys, that's the video. Like, comment, subscribe. I have more videos coming out. The next video is going to be on how to keep going. How to go into your mind and be disciplined in what you're doing and never stop. That is going to be a very good video, especially when it correlates to all my other videos with fasting and mindset. The mindset is everything, because if you go into something without the right mindset, you're going to be destroyed. So once again, like, comment, subscribe, and stay safe out there, family.